The Discipline of Waiting Like a Millionaire by Wealthy Mindset Audiobooks. Most people who struggle with money are not struggling because they care too little. They are struggling because they care too much, and in caring too much, they act too often. The problem is rarely a shortage of effort or attention or genuine intention. The problem, more often than not, is what all of that effort is quietly doing to a process that was never designed to be managed this closely. What follows is not a lesson in strategy or a framework for better decisions. It is an invitation to see, perhaps for the first time with real clarity, why the smartest move available to you on most days is the one that requires nothing from you at all. There is a particular kind of financial exhaustion that no one talks about, because from the outside, it does not look like exhaustion at all. It looks like diligence. It looks like someone who is serious about their future, someone who reads the articles, tracks the numbers, listens to the right voices, and shows up consistently to the work of trying to build something that lasts. And yet, beneath that appearance of engagement, something quieter is happening. Something that does not have a clean name but is immediately recognizable to anyone who has lived inside it. It is the feeling of working very hard at something that refuses to work back. This is not the struggle of someone who is careless with money. The person we are talking about is not gambling, not spending recklessly, not ignoring the basics. They are doing, by almost every visible measure, the right things. They are saving. They are informed. They are paying attention in a way that most people around them simply are not. And still, the results feel thin. Not catastrophically thin, not thin in a way that announces itself as failure, but quietly, persistently thin. Like a fire, they keep feeding that never quite produces the warmth they were promised. If you have felt this, you already know how disorienting it is, because the logic should hold. Effort should produce results. Attention should produce progress. That is the fundamental contract we were taught in classrooms and in the early lessons of working life, and it has served well enough in most areas to feel reliably true. But somewhere in the territory of money and time and compounding, that contract seems to break down. And when effort stops producing results in the expected proportion, most people respond the way they have always responded to a problem. They try harder. They engage more. They add another source, another strategy, another layer of attention to a situation that is somehow not responding to attention the way it should. Consider how much of your financial life has been shaped by this impulse. The late-night account checking that rarely reveals anything new, but happens anyway, pulled by a gravitational need to feel connected to the numbers. The strategy that was working, replaced by a strategy that seemed to be working better, replaced in turn by a third strategy discovered in a moment of doubt about the second. The position held through months of patience, then exited during a week of discomfort, then watched from a painful distance as it recovered and climbed to exactly the place it was always heading. These are not the decisions of someone who does not care. They are the decisions of someone who cares so much that caring itself has become the problem. The assumption that drives this is almost never examined because it feels too foundational to question. Most people believe, with genuine conviction, that the distance between where they are and where they want to be is a knowledge gap. They believe that somewhere out there is the insight, the book, the system, the approach that will finally make things click, and that the work of financial progress is essentially the work of finding it. This belief is not irrational. In many fields, it would be correct. But in the domain of wealth built across time, it quietly leads people toward more information, when what they need is a different relationship with the information they already have. What almost never gets examined is the impulse itself, the need to act, the deep, almost physiological discomfort of sitting still while something important feels unresolved. The voice that says something must be done, and that says it with such convincing urgency that questioning it feels like irresponsibility. This impulse is not stupidity. It is not even impatience in the shallow sense. It is the natural response of a conscientious person to a situation that feels consequential, and it is, quietly and reliably, one of the most expensive forces in financial life. Morgan Housel once observed that doing nothing is the hardest financial skill to develop, precisely because it looks from the inside and from the outside like you are not doing anything. And in a world that equates financial seriousness with financial activity, that appearance is nearly intolerable for someone who genuinely cares. Here is the uncomfortable truth that changes the shape of everything that follows. The most costly financial decisions most people have ever made were not made in ignorance. They were made in urgency, with full attention, by people who were trying very hard to do the right thing. The information was not the problem. The feeling driving the decision was the problem. And until that distinction is clearly seen, until the difference between a signal worth responding to and a feeling demanding relief is genuinely understood, more information will simply produce more expensive decisions made with greater confidence. Something shifts when you realize that the question is not what you have been doing. The question is how you have been feeling while you do it. And that shift, quiet as it is, changes everything that comes after. When something is not working, the most natural response in the world is to look for what you are doing wrong. And if you look long enough without finding the answer, you begin to look harder. More sources, more frameworks, more analysis, more effort applied to the search itself. This is not a character flaw. It is the instinct of someone who takes the problem seriously. But there is a particular kind of error that this instinct cannot detect, because the error is not in the quality of your effort. It is in the assumption underneath it. It is the belief, absorbed so early and reinforced so consistently that it rarely surfaces for examination, that financial progress is fundamentally a management problem, one that rewards the attentive, the responsive, and the continuously engaged. This belief feels not just reasonable, but responsible. It is the conclusion that almost any thoughtful person would reach after observing how the world generally works. In most areas of life, showing up consistently and paying close attention does produce better results. The employee who monitors their work carefully outperforms the one who does not. The business owner who tracks their numbers weekly makes better decisions than the one who checks in quarterly. Attention, in most domains, is a genuine competitive advantage. And so, when this same logic is carried into financial life, when the person who cares about their future decides that caring means watching closely and responding quickly, it feels like the extension of a principle that has always served them well. The problem is that wealth, built across time through the mechanism of compounding, operates on a logic that is almost precisely inverted. It does not reward the most attentive. It rewards the most disciplined in their inattention. It does not produce its greatest returns for the person who responds to the most signals. It produces them for the person who has learned which signals do not require a response at all. And this distinction, so counterintuitive that most people encounter it only in hindsight, if they encounter it at all, is where the misdiagnosis lives. There is a set of findings from brokerage research that is circulated quietly in behavioral finance for years, rarely given the prominence it deserves, perhaps because its implication is too uncomfortable to sit with for long. When analysts examined which investor accounts had performed best over extended periods, they expected to find the hallmarks of engaged, thoughtful management: regular rebalancing, responsive positioning, careful attention to changing conditions. What they found instead was something that initially seemed like an anomaly. The best performing accounts belonged to investors who had, for various reasons, essentially stopped participating. Some had forgotten the accounts existed. Some had become too ill to manage them. Some had died. The money had simply been left alone, untouched, compounding in the quiet, while the world turned and markets fluctuated, and every rational instinct in every active investor said that something ought to be done. The accounts that performed worst were the most active, not the most reckless, the most active, the ones with the most decisions, the most adjustments, the most evidence of ongoing, earnest attention. What makes this finding so important is not what it reveals about investing. It is what it reveals about the cost structure of the active management belief, because the losses generated by overactivity are almost never recorded as losses. When you exit a position that would have doubled in the following 2 years, your balance does not decline. It simply fails to grow the way it would have. The cost is invisible. It is not subtracted. It is withheld. And withheld costs are the most dangerous kind, precisely because they leave no scar, no clear lesson, no moment of reckoning that might interrupt the pattern. The behavior is quietly reinforced because it did not feel catastrophic, and so it continues. James Clear once wrote that you do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems. In financial life, the system most people are operating inside is one that was designed to measure competence through responsiveness. The financial media is structured around it. The brokerage interface is designed to facilitate it. The language of financial engagement, portfolio management, active oversight, staying informed, all of it points toward motion as the default expression of seriousness. And the person who sits still, who holds without adjusting, who resists the pull toward intervention during a volatile month, does not look serious from the outside. They look passive. They look to the culture around them and sometimes to themselves, like someone who is not really trying. This is the misdiagnosis in its most precise form. Not a misunderstanding of markets or returns or strategy, but a misunderstanding of what financial discipline actually looks like when it is working. We have been measuring it by the wrong instrument entirely. Not by the quality of what is held and allowed to grow, but by the volume of decisions made and the speed with which they were made. And because the wrong instrument continues to show what feels like the right reading, the diagnosis repeats, the treatment intensifies, and the gap between effort and result quietly widens, invisible, unregistered, waiting to be understood. By this point, you may have already begun to suspect that the problem is not what it appeared to be when you first started paying attention to your finances. It is not a shortage of information. It is not a failure of discipline in the ordinary sense of that word. It is something quieter and considerably more personal, something that operates not in the spreadsheet or the brokerage account, but in the body, in the specific, unmistakable sensation that arrives when money is at stake and the outcome is uncertain and the future refuses to confirm in any legible way that everything is going to be fine. That sensation is not weakness. It is biology. The nervous system, shaped across hundreds of thousands of years to treat ambiguity as danger, does not distinguish meaningfully between the uncertainty of a fluctuating market and the uncertainty of a physical threat. Both register as conditions requiring resolution. Both produce the same internal pressure, a mounting discomfort that demands response. that will not quietly subside until something is done to restore the feeling of agency and control. This is not a character flaw to be overcome. It is a wiring pattern to be understood. And until it is understood, it will continue to present itself convincingly and repeatedly as financial judgment. This is what makes the pattern so extraordinarily difficult to detect. It does not arrive wearing the face of anxiety. It arrives wearing the face of diligence. The decision to check the portfolio again, to reconsider a position that has been held for 6 uncomfortable months, to research an alternative that seems to be performing better. None of this feels like a nervous system seeking relief. All of it feels like a responsible person doing responsible things. The internal experience is indistinguishable from genuine financial engagement, which is precisely why the pattern persists across years and sometimes across entire financial lifetimes without ever being clearly named. Consider what happens when financial literacy increases. The reasonable expectation is that more knowledge should produce more rational behavior, that understanding how compounding works, or how markets cycle, or how behavioral biases distort decision-making should provide some protection against those same biases. And in a narrow intellectual sense, it does. The financially literate person knows, in the abstract, that reacting to short-term volatility is counterproductive. They have read the research. They understand the principle. But understanding a principle and being governed by it in a moment of genuine discomfort are two entirely different things. What financial literacy often provides, in practice, is not immunity from the pattern, but a more sophisticated vocabulary for rationalizing it. The anxiety that would have said in a less informed person, "I need to do something," now says, instead, the macroeconomic indicators suggest a defensive repositioning may be prudent. The feeling is the same. The justification is simply more convincing to others and especially to the person producing it. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the impediment to action advances action, and what stands in the way becomes the way. There is a version of this truth that applies here with uncomfortable precision. The very intelligence brought to financial life can become the mechanism through which the pattern defends itself. The smarter the investor, the better the story. And the better the story, the longer the pattern runs undisturbed. What the research consistently reveals across decades of behavioral finance is a finding that sits in direct contradiction to the intuition that knowledge and engagement produce superior returns. The investors who accumulate most meaningfully over long periods are not, as a group, the ones who made the best individual decisions. They are the ones who made the fewest unnecessary ones, not because they were passive or indifferent, but because they had developed, through experience or temperament or some combination of both, a capacity to remain in uncertainty without being compelled to resolve it artificially. They had learned, in other words, to feel the discomfort and not act on it, to let the discomfort pass, as it always eventually does, without leaving a transaction in its wake. The durability of this pattern, in those who have not yet reached that capacity, comes precisely from its invisibility. It does not announce itself as failure. It does not produce moments of clear, corrective reckoning. It simply interrupts the compounding quietly at each point of peak discomfort and allows the investor to walk away feeling that they made a considered decision rather than an emotional one. The account does not decline dramatically. The opportunity cost leaves no mark. And so, the lesson that might have changed everything is never clearly delivered. Perhaps the most uncomfortable part of recognizing this pattern is understanding who it belongs to. It does not belong to the careless or the uninformed. It belongs to the conscientious. To the ones who care enough to pay attention, who feel the weight of financial decisions seriously enough that uncertainty becomes genuinely difficult to tolerate. In a different context, these would be the qualities of someone you would trust with something important. In this one, they are the qualities that make the pattern most likely to take hold and most difficult to release. That recognition, uncomfortable as it is also the beginning of something more useful than any strategy yet encountered. There is a version of financial struggle that never makes it into the conversations people have openly. It does not look like struggle from the outside. It does not involve debt collectors or dramatic losses or the kind of visible crisis that earns sympathy and practical advice. It looks, from any external vantage point, like competence. Like someone who has their finances organized, who knows what they own and why they own it, who stays current with what is happening in the markets and responds thoughtfully when conditions shift. The appearance is real. The effort behind it is genuine. And yet, something beneath the surface does not match the presentation, something that rarely gets spoken aloud because it is difficult to explain without sounding ungrateful or confused, or somehow both at once. That something is the persistent, quietly destabilizing sense that the gap is not closing, not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself as failure, but steadily, almost imperceptibly, the distance between where the effort is pointed and where the results are arriving remains wider than it should be. It is the feeling of rowing with genuine commitment toward a horizon that continues to recede at exactly the pace of your progress. The motion is real. The direction feels correct, and yet arrival never quite comes. This feeling, held long enough, does something to a person that goes beyond frustration. It begins to erode something more foundational than a financial plan. It begins to erode the quiet confidence that the financial life they once imagined for themselves is actually available to them. Not through any single moment of reckoning, but through the slow accumulation of evidence that careful effort and meaningful results are, in their case, somehow decoupled. And when that decoupling persists long enough without explanation, the mind begins to fill the explanatory gap with the only remaining hypothesis that perhaps they are simply not the kind of person who builds what they set out to build. Think about the investor in their mid to late 40s who sits down one afternoon with a decade of account statements and does the honest arithmetic. They were not reckless. They did not make the obvious mistakes. They saved consistently, stayed informed, managed their positions with genuine attention. And yet, the number in front of them is meaningfully smaller than a decade of that effort should have produced. Not catastrophically smaller. Not in a way that points to any single identifiable error. Just quietly, stubbornly smaller than it should be. What they are looking at is not the result of ignorance or indiscipline. It is the accumulated cost of 1,000 small, well-intentioned interruptions to a process that needed, above almost everything else, simply to be left alone. The regret produced by this realization is unlike the regret of a clear mistake. A clear mistake has edges. It has a before and an after, a decision that can be named, a lesson that can be extracted and carried forward. This regret has none of that structure. It is the regret of an absence, of returns never received, of compounding never completed, of a future that existed as a genuine possibility and was displaced incrementally and invisibly by the sum of all the reasonable, careful decisions that interrupted it. There is no single moment to point to. There is only the faint, disorienting sense that something was lost, without the ability to say precisely when or how much. What makes this particularly difficult is what it tends to produce next. Rather than prompting a reconsideration of the pattern, this kind of unlocatable regret often deepens it. The person who cannot identify what went wrong naturally concludes that the answer is more vigilance, not less, more attention, more management, more active engagement with a process that has not been responding to engagement the way it should. And so the pattern that created the problem becomes the prescribed solution to it. The belief that stillness is dangerous, that to stop managing is to invite the very failure they have been working to prevent, tightens rather than loosens. The exhaustion increases. The gap persists. Seneca wrote that it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it. In financial life, the waste rarely looks like waste. It looks like work. It looks like the responsible behavior of someone who takes their future seriously. And that is precisely what makes it so difficult to interrupt. Because the interruption requires a willingness to question not just a strategy, but an identity. To consider that the version of yourself you have built around financial attentiveness may itself be the thing standing between you and the results that attentiveness was always meant to produce. That consideration does not arrive loudly. It arrives the way most important realizations do, quietly, in a moment when the effort has finally become heavy enough that carrying it without question is no longer possible. It arrives as a kind of tiredness that is distinct from discouragement. It is the tiredness of someone who has been genuinely trying for a genuinely long time and has finally become willing to ask whether trying harder is actually the answer, or whether something in the trying itself needs to change. There is a moment that arrives differently for different people, but when it arrives, it tends to be quiet. It is not the moment of a dramatic loss or a sudden revelation. It is smaller than that, and somehow more significant. It is the moment when a person stops asking what they should do next and begins asking something they have never quite asked before. What if the doing is the problem? This is not a comfortable question. It runs against the grain of almost everything we have been conditioned to believe about effort and progress and the relationship between the two. But it is the question that opens the only doorway worth walking through at this stage of the conversation. Because everything examined so far, the exhaustion, the invisible pattern, the misdiagnosis, the compounding regret, all of it points toward a single realization that, once seen clearly, reorganizes the financial picture entirely. Time is not the corridor you walk down on the way to wealth. It is the mechanism producing the wealth. This distinction is simple enough to state and genuinely difficult to absorb, because absorbing it requires releasing a metaphor that most of us have held since we first began thinking about money and the future. We tend to imagine financial progress as a journey, something we are traveling toward, something that requires navigation and momentum and continuous forward motion. But compounding does not work that way. It does not reward the traveler. It rewards the one who plants something and then steps back and allows the conditions for growth to remain undisturbed. Every unnecessary intervention is not a course correction. It is a disruption of the very process doing the work. Waiting, understood through this lens, is not passivity. It is not the absence of strategy. It is, in the most precise sense, the strategy itself, the deliberate, structurally informed choice to protect the compounding process from the single force most likely to interrupt it. That force is not the market. It is not inflation or volatility or the unpredictability of economic cycles. It is the investor's own urgency, the well-intentioned, conscientious, entirely understandable impulse to do something when the feeling of uncertainty becomes difficult to hold. The distinction that actually changes behavior is not the one between action and inaction. That framing keeps the focus in the wrong place, on the external decision rather than the internal source of it. The distinction that matters is between a response to a real signal and a response to a feeling. A real signal has evidence behind it. It reflects a genuine change in the underlying conditions that informed the original decision. A feeling, by contrast, reflects a change in internal comfort level, in the investor's tolerance for uncertainty on a particular day, in a particular mood, after a particular news cycle. Both can produce identical-looking decisions. Only one of them is a financial decision. The other is an emotional transaction disguised as one. Think of a sailor navigating by the stars across open water. The surface of the ocean is never still. Waves arrive constantly, some small, some significant, all of them real, and all of them carrying information about the immediate conditions. A sailor who adjusts the helm in response to every wave will be continuously busy. They will feel, with some justification, that they are engaged and responsive and taking the voyage seriously. But they will not arrive anywhere meaningful because the waves are not the voyage. The stars are the voyage. The steady heading maintained through the continuous disturbance of the surface. That is the discipline. And the sailor who has learned to distinguish between the information worth responding to and the information worth simply observing will always, across sufficient distance, outperform the one who has not. What separates the investors who accumulate most meaningfully across long periods from those who accumulate less is rarely what it appears to be from the outside. It is not superior information. It is not unusual intelligence or access to opportunities unavailable to others. It is something more interior than any of those things. It is an extended emotional time horizon, a capacity to experience the natural urgency of uncertainty across years rather than days. This extended horizon is not a personality trait fixed at birth. It is a perspective developed through understanding, and it grants access to returns that a shorter emotional horizon, regardless of the intelligence behind it, is structurally unable to reach. Not because the shorter horizon makes worse decisions, but because it exits the positions that longer horizons stay in long enough to become something. Here is what changes when this is genuinely understood rather than simply acknowledged. The impulse to act does not disappear, but it loses a certain authority when you can observe in real time that the pressure building behind a financial decision is coming from discomfort rather than from evidence. When you can name it accurately as a feeling, seeking resolution rather than a signal requiring response, the impulse no longer commands the same automatic compliance. It does not need to be suppressed. It simply needs to be seen for what it is. And seeing it clearly is, by itself, enough to change what happens next. The most sophisticated financial move available on most days is not a repositioning or a reallocation or a response to breaking news. It is the protection of a process that is already working from the one source of interference most likely to disrupt it. That source is you. And knowing that, clearly and without judgment, is the beginning of a genuinely different relationship with money. Understanding something intellectually and being changed by it are two different experiences, and the distance between them is where most good ideas go to quietly expire. You can read about compounding and still interrupt it. You can know that reactive decisions are costly and still make them, because knowing and being restructured by knowing are not the same thing. What changes behavior is not information retained in the mind. It is a shift in the lens through which a situation is perceived, a shift so fundamental that the same set of circumstances begins to produce a different internal experience, and therefore of each different response. This is the kind of shift that becomes available once the insight from the previous stage has had time to settle. Not the intellectual acknowledgement of it, but the genuine absorption of it. The moment when the reframe stops being a concept you are holding and becomes the natural way you see. And when that happens, something changes in the daily experience of financial life that is difficult to describe from the outside, but unmistakable from within. The account statement that once produced a specific kind of anxiety, the scanning for what has declined, the mental arithmetic of what was and what is now, begins to carry different weight. Not because the numbers have changed, but because the relationship to the numbers has. The fluctuation that previously felt like a problem requiring immediate assessment now registers more accurately as information about a moment, not a verdict about a trajectory. The market movement that once triggered the familiar sequence of checking, weighing, and considering whether something ought to be done now passes through a different filter, one that asks, quietly and without drama, whether this is actually a signal or simply the surface in motion. This is where identity begins to do something interesting. For a long time, the identity organized around financial life was built on attentiveness, on the pride of being the person who stays informed, who manages carefully, who does not let things drift. That identity was not dishonest. The attentiveness was real. The care was genuine. But it was organized around the wrong expression of those qualities. It measured its own seriousness by the volume of its engagement, by the frequency of its decisions, by the feeling of being actively involved in the management of something important. And when that identity begins to reorganize, when it starts to locate its seriousness not in the frequency of intervention, but in the discipline of restraint, something quietly fundamental has changed. This shift does not feel like giving up. That is perhaps the most important thing to say about it, because the fear that prevents many people from making it is precisely the fear that stepping back from active management means becoming passive, becoming negligent, becoming the person who is not paying attention while the situation requires attention. But that is not what this feels like from the inside. It feels, once it genuinely arrives, like the difference between gripping a steering wheel so tightly that the tension in your hands travels through the car and holding it with the steady, calibrated pressure of someone who trusts both the vehicle and their own ability to respond if the road actually changes. The control is still there. It is simply no longer exhausting itself on conditions that do not require it. In practical terms, this manifests in a change that is visible not in any single decision, but in the overall texture of how decisions get made. The question that used to arrive automatically, "What should I do about this?" begins to be preceded by a quieter, more structurally important question. Is this actually asking me to do anything? That pause, brief as it often is, represents an enormous amount of behavioral change compressed into a single moment of awareness. It is the difference between reacting and responding, between being moved by discomfort and choosing consciously whether the discomfort contains a genuine instruction. What follows, across months rather than days, is a pattern that looks different from the outside and feels different from the inside. Fewer decisions, but each one carrying more genuine intention. Less turbulence in the day-to-day experience of managing money, not because the markets have become less volatile, but because the investor's relationship with volatility has changed. A growing capacity to hold uncertainty without resolving it artificially, to let ambiguous periods remain ambiguous without demanding that they be clarified through action. Napoleon Hill once observed that patience, persistence, and perspiration make an unbeatable combination for success. The patience he described is not waiting in the passive sense. It is the active, disciplined holding of a position that has been thoughtfully chosen. The refusal to abandon a sound structure simply because the present moment is uncomfortable. The groundedness that emerges from this shift is not the groundedness of someone who has stopped caring. It is the groundedness of someone whose concern has been properly calibrated. who has learned, through genuine understanding rather than forced discipline, to reserve their response for the signals that actually warrant one. That calibration, once developed, does not need to be maintained through constant effort. It begins to feel, with increasing naturalness, simply like clarity. There is a particular test that reveals, more clearly than almost any other, where a person actually stands in their relationship with financial patience. It arrives without announcement, usually during a week when the markets have moved in an uncomfortable direction and the headlines have found their most alarming register. The test is simply this: what do you do with the urge to check? Not whether you check, most people check, but what happens in the moment before checking, and what you are actually looking for when you do. Because if you examine that impulse honestly, what you will almost always find is not a person seeking financial information. The information has not changed in any meaningful way since the last time you looked. What you will find is a person seeking relief, seeking the particular comfort of feeling connected to something that feels out of control, seeking, in the most fundamental sense, a reduction in the discomfort of not knowing what is happening and not being able to affect it. This is not a criticism. It is a description of something deeply human. But it is also under the new lens developed across the preceding pages of this audiobook, now visible in a way it was not before. And visibility changes the experience. The urge to check during a volatile week does not disappear, but it is no longer experienced as a neutral or necessary act. It is recognized accurately for what it is: a search for emotional resolution presenting itself as financial diligence. And that recognition, held steadily, creates a pause that did not previously exist. In that pause lives an enormous amount of behavioral change. Consider what the old sequence looked like in practice. A market dip arrives. The dip triggers checking. Checking surfaces the numbers in their current, unflattering state and activates the anxiety that was already present but previously abstract. The anxiety generates pressure. The pressure demands resolution. And resolution arrives in the form of a decision, a rebalancing, an exit, a redirect towards something that appears in that moment to be performing better. The action provides temporary relief. The compounding is interrupted. And the sequence has completed itself so smoothly and so quickly that it barely registered as a sequence at all. It registered as management, as the responsible behavior of someone taking their financial life seriously. Now consider what the same moment looks like through a different perception. The dip arrives. It is recognized not as an emergency requiring triage, but as weather, not irrelevant. Weather is real. Weather affects conditions, but not the forecast either. The portfolio is not the dip. The portfolio is the horizon. The dip is what is happening on the surface today, and the horizon is where the structure is pointed across years. These are two different things, and the person who has genuinely absorbed this distinction no longer experiences them as the same thing. The dip passes through awareness without triggering the sequence. The compounding continues undisturbed. What shifts in practical terms is not the presence of emotion, but its role. There has always been a version of financial wisdom that suggested emotion should be removed from investing entirely, that the ideal investor is a purely rational actor, unmoved by sentiment, making decisions from clean data alone. This version is both unachievable and unnecessary. Emotion does not need to be eliminated from financial life. It needs to be understood well enough to know when it is contributing something useful and when it is hijacking the process entirely. Concern is useful. It keeps attention appropriately allocated. Anxiety when it crosses into the territory of demanding resolution through action, is not useful. It is a cost. And the self-knowledge required to distinguish between the two in real time, in the middle of an uncomfortable week, is among the most practically valuable things that can be developed. James Clear has written that every action you take is a vote for the type of person you wish to become. In financial life, every non-action taken from awareness rather than avoidance is equally a vote. The choice not to rebalance unnecessarily, not to exit during a period of discomfort, not to redirect capital toward whatever narrative is currently loudest. Each of these is a decision with compounding consequences, invisible in the moment and significant across years. They do not feel like decisions from the inside because they produce no visible transaction, no account activity, no confirmation email. But they are decisions. They are, in aggregate, a strategy of considerable elegance, one that works precisely because it requires nothing from the market and everything from the investor's own capacity for steady, grounded inaction. The contrast between this approach and the previous one will not be visible in any single month or quarter. It is visible only across the length of time that compounding requires to express itself fully. One portfolio was continuously interrupted, each interruption feeling justified, each one leaving no obvious scar. The other was consistently protected, the protection feeling almost indistinguishable from passivity from the outside and accumulating invisibly into something substantially different. What replaces the urgency, once it has been seen for what it is not indifference. It is something steadier and more sustainable than indifference. It is the quiet awareness that the work is being done, that time is the instrument, that the structure is sound, and that the most important contribution available on most days is simply the discipline not to interfere with what is already working. There is something worth pausing to notice at this point in the conversation. Not about markets or strategies or the mechanics of compounding, but about what has happened in the listener who has traveled this far. The person who arrived at the beginning of this audiobook carried a specific kind of tension. It was not the tension of someone who had given up or stopped caring. It was the tension of someone who had been caring, consistently and seriously, and found that their caring was not producing what caring is supposed to produce. They were attentive and still felt behind. They were diligent and still felt the gap. They had done, by most visible measures, the right things, and the right things had returned results that felt quietly, stubbornly insufficient. That tension has not been resolved by providing new information. It has been resolved by changing the lens through which the original situation is now perceived. And this is the only resolution that actually holds, because information without a changed lens simply gets processed through the same assumptions that produced the problem in the first place. What has shifted is not the facts of the situation, it is the framework around the facts. And when the framework changes, the situation itself appears to change, not because anything external has moved, but because the person looking at it has. The original frustration, effort without proportional result, now has an explanation that requires no self-criticism to hold. It was not a failure of intelligence. It was not a failure of discipline in any meaningful sense of that word. It was the natural, entirely predictable consequence of applying the wrong kind of effort to a process that rewards a specific quality of restraint that our culture has never particularly celebrated or clearly taught. The effort was real. The intention was sound. The framework was misaligned, and misaligned frameworks, regardless of the effort applied within them, produce results that consistently disappoint in ways that are difficult to diagnose because the effort itself feels like evidence that the framework must be correct. What has emerged across this conversation is something more coherent than a collection of insights. It is a single, unified understanding that holds philosophy, emotion, and behavior together without contradiction. Wealth, built meaningfully across time, compounds through structure. Structure, to do its work, requires protection. And the thing it most requires protection from is not market volatility or economic uncertainty or any of the external forces that financial media spends most of its energy addressing. It requires protection from the internal force that is present in every investor who cares about the outcome, the well-intentioned, anxiety-driven, entirely human impulse to improve what is already working, to intervene in what is already in motion, to resolve through action what time was already in the process of resolving on its own. Morgan Housel has written that the ability to do nothing when others are doing something and to do something when others are doing nothing is one of the most valuable and underrated financial skills. What he is describing is not contrarianism, it is structural awareness, the capacity to act from understanding rather than from the ambient pressure of what everyone around you appears to be doing. That capacity is exactly what this framework produces when it has been genuinely absorbed rather than merely acknowledged. The growth that follows from this understanding will not announce itself. It will not arrive with a quarter that finally feels like the breakthrough, or a statement that dramatically confirms the approach. It will arrive the way most meaningful accumulation arrives, incrementally, quietly, visible only in the rearview mirror of years. But there is something important about that quietness that is easy to miss. It is not the quietness of stagnation. It is the quietness of a process operating without interference. And a process operating without interference, given sufficient time and a sound underlying structure, is very nearly unstoppable. Perhaps the most significant quality of genuine understanding is its irreversibility. Once you have seen, clearly and without the protection of rationalization, that urgency is the disguise anxiety wears in financial life. Once you have recognized, in your own history, the specific and repeated pattern of well-intentioned interruptions to processes that were already working, you cannot return to the previous state of not having seen it. Every future moment of financial discomfort will carry this awareness forward. Every impulse to act will pass through the filter of a question that did not previously exist. Is this a signal, or is this a feeling seeking resolution? That question, asked consistently and answered honestly, changes the financial life across years in ways that no single decision ever could. The person listening now is not the person who pressed play at the beginning of this audiobook. Something has settled, not dramatically, not with the feeling of a sudden transformation, but with the quiet, stable quality of a truth that has found its proper place. Not because you were told what to do, but because something you already suspected about the nature of patience and urgency and the real cost of well-intentioned interference has finally been given a shape clear enough to hold and steady enough to carry forward into everything that comes next. What patience genuinely offers, once it is understood rather than merely prescribed, is not the absence of uncertainty. Uncertainty does not disappear. Markets remain unpredictable. The future remains unconfirmed. The forces that make financial life feel consequential and sometimes threatening continue to operate exactly as they always have. What changes is the relationship with uncertainty, from a condition that must be resolved to a condition that can be inhabited, from an emergency that demands response to a climate that requires steadiness. This is not a small shift. It is, in practical terms, the difference between a financial life experienced as a continuous series of problems requiring management and one experienced as a structure trusted to work across time. There is something genuinely settling in the practice of allowing time to do what time does when left to work undisturbed. Not the performance of patience, not the gritted teeth endurance of someone waiting for permission to act again, but the actual practice of choosing each day to trust a process that does not require intervention. This trust, built through understanding rather than forced through willpower, carries a quality that is difficult to describe from the outside but recognizable from within. It is the quality that the most experienced builders of wealth tend to carry. Not excitement, not urgency, not the animated engagement of someone constantly repositioning. Something more settled than any of those things. A groundedness that comes from having accumulated enough evidence across enough time that calm is not just temperamentally preferable, but structurally superior. Seneca wrote that the mind that is anxious about the future is miserable. He did not mean that the future should be ignored or that preparation is misguided. He meant that anxiety about what cannot yet be known is a tax paid in advance on a bill that may never arrive, and that the person who learns to inhabit the present with steadiness rather than projecting themselves anxiously into an unresolved future lives with a quality of ease that no external circumstance can reliably provide. Financial maturity arrives the way most genuine maturity does, not in a single moment of transformation, not through a decision made and implemented and complete. It arrives gradually, almost imperceptibly, as the distance between a feeling and a response to that feeling grows just long enough for something clearer than the feeling to enter. One day, the gap is a second. Then it is a breath. Then it is long enough to ask the question that changes everything. The growth is real before it is visible. The shift is happening before it can be measured. And perhaps the most quietly important thing to recognize at this particular moment is this: the listener who has stayed with this, who has allowed these ideas to settle rather than immediately reaching for the next input, the next action, the next resolution, is already practicing the thing this entire audiobook has been describing. The stillness you are sitting in right now is not the absence of progress. It is the practice itself. And the practice, held with understanding, is already working. There is a particular kind of wisdom that does not feel like wisdom when it first arrives. It feels like permission. Permission to stop doing something that was never producing what it promised. Permission to trust a process that has been working quietly beneath the surface of all the activity layered on top of it. Permission to redefine, in a fundamental way, what financial seriousness actually looks like when it is expressed by someone who genuinely understands what they are working with. That permission is what this entire conversation has been building toward. Not a new strategy, not a revised approach to portfolio management, or a refined framework for timing decisions. Something more foundational than any of those things. A different understanding of what the work actually is and what it is not. The fundamental truth, stated as plainly as it deserves to be stated, is this: the wealth that compounds most meaningfully across a lifetime is not built by the person who acts most often. It is built by the person who has developed the capacity to distinguish the rare moments that genuinely require action from the far more numerous moments that require something considerably harder: the disciplined, aware, deliberate choice to wait. This distinction sounds simple. It is not simple to practice, because the moments that require patience arrive wearing the same clothing as the moments that require action. And the only instrument reliable enough to tell them apart is an understanding of your own psychology that most financial education never asks you to develop. But here is what is important to carry forward from that truth. It is not, at its core, a financial principle. It is a human one. The capacity to remain in discomfort without resolving it artificially, to hold uncertainty without demanding that it clarify itself on your schedule, is among the rarest and most generative capabilities a person can develop in any domain of meaningful endeavor. The writer, who can sit with an unfinished sentence long enough for the right word to arrive, rather than filling the space with the nearest available word, produces something different from the one who cannot. The leader, who can hold the tension of an unresolved problem long enough for genuine understanding to emerge, rather than defaulting to the most immediately available solution, builds something different from the one who cannot. The investor, who can remain in the discomfort of a fluctuating position long enough for the underlying value to express itself, rather than exiting at the peak of uncertainty, accumulates something different from the one who cannot. The skill is the same skill. The domain changes. The underlying human challenge does not. What this audiobook has been attempting, across every section and every layer of insight, is not to teach patience as a virtue to be admired and aspired to. It has been attempting to show patience as a practice to be understood, one with a specific psychological architecture, a specific set of obstacles, and a specific and learnable capacity at its center. The obstacle is not laziness or indifference. It is the nervous system's legitimate but often misdirected demand for resolution. The capacity is not the suppression of that demand, but the awareness of it, the developed ability to observe the impulse, name it accurately, and choose from understanding rather than from reaction whether it deserves a response. Dale Carnegie once observed that most of the important things in the world have been accomplished by people who kept on trying when there seemed to be no hope at all. There is a version of this that applies directly to the practice of patient investing, except the trying, in this context, looks nothing like conventional effort. It looks like holding. It looks like remaining. It looks, from the outside, almost like doing nothing. And it requires, from the inside, more sustained intentionality than most visible forms of financial activity ever demand. Waiting, properly understood, is not the default of the person who has run out of better options. It is the chosen strategy of the person who has developed enough clarity to see that the process already in motion does not need improvement. It is not passive. It is, in the fullest sense of the word, active, an ongoing, daily, sometimes uncomfortable choice to protect what is already working from the well-meaning interference of a mind that has not yet learned to trust what it cannot see accumulating. Every day that choice is made, something compounds, not just in the account, in the person making the choice, in the gradually deepening capacity to hold uncertainty with steadiness, in the slowly expanding emotional time horizon that makes longer returns structurally accessible, in the growing distance between a feeling and a response to that feeling that is the truest measure of financial maturity. And so, we arrive at the line that holds everything this conversation has explored, distilled to its most essential form. The line that belongs to anyone who has ever sat with uncertainty and chosen, consciously, not to flinch. The most powerful financial decision you will make today is the one you decide not to make.